bought for the price of a broken mule. A Lakota chief paid the man in silver and set her free. The mule was dying when I bought her. Not the woman, the mule. I want to be clear on that because this story gets told wrong sometimes, by people who weren't there and don't know what the ground looked like in the valley below the Niobrara that autumn, or how cold it came in off the hills before the light even left the sky. The mule was a gray-brown thing with a hip wound that had gone bad, and the man selling her knew it, and I knew it, and we both pretended otherwise long enough for money to change hands. $8. I had 11 left to my name. That's the kind of man I was in the fall of 1876. 43 years old, owned a bedroll and a survey kit, and a mule I just killed $8 on. The woman I didn't buy, that comes later. And it wasn't buying, not exactly, though the chief used that word paid when he put the silver in my hand. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you've carried something for 30 years. It gets out of order. Let me start with the railroad. I'd been with the survey crews since '66, 10 years. I was 23 when I started, working for a man named Hargrove Pell who had a government contract to map a route through the high plains for a spur line that was supposed to connect Cheyenne to Bismarck. I was good with numbers. Good with elevations and grade calculations, and the kind of thinking that tells you whether a mountain pass will hold a locomotive in February. They put me at the front of the crew, ahead of the laborers, walking with a transit level on a tripod that weighed more than most of the younger men could carry in the afternoon heat. I walked that thing for 600 miles. The spur line got built, and the railroad made 3 fortunes, and I made wages. My name is in the records somewhere. I know it is, because I put it there myself in the survey logs, but it's not on anything anybody reads. That's not bitterness talking, it's just true. I understood the arrangement. I was a working man, and working men trade their days for money, and the men who own the money put their names on the things that get built. I understood that. What I didn't understand, and what took me another decade to sort out, was why I kept doing it after the railroad didn't need me anymore. They let me go in '74. Pell had died, heart failure, and the new superintendent had his own survey men who'd come up from St. Louis, and they had better instruments than I did, and they were cheaper because there were more of them. That's the other thing about working men. They're always being replaced by cheaper ones. I took my final wages, $47 and a handshake, and I walked out of the company yard in Cheyenne on a Tuesday morning in June, and I stood on the street, and I didn't know a single thing I was supposed to do next. I tried freighting for a while. Then I tried logging, up in the Wyoming high country where a man named Birch ran a crew cutting timber for the mine shafts. That lasted 1 winter. The cold got into my left knee, an old injury. I'd taken a fall off a ridge in '69, and the joint had never been right, and by March I couldn't bend it past a right angle, and Birch let me go. I drifted southeast, doing whatever came up. Some fencing work, some hauling, one summer shoveling at a placer mine on the Laramie where the pay was decent, but the foreman was a drunk who had a habit of deciding certain men owed him more work than they'd agreed to. I left that camp in the middle of the night owing nothing to no one except the cook, a Mexican man named Ruiz who'd been kind to me, and I'd paid him back in the spring with some deer meat I'd taken out of a draw east of the camp. So I left clean. By the time I bought the dying mule, I had been drifting for 2 years. Not aimlessly, exactly. I always had some destination in mind, some piece of work I was heading toward. But looking back now, I can see what it really was. It was a man who'd spent his whole life being useful to other people's purposes, and had no purpose of his own, and was filling in the space where a purpose should have been with motion. Keep moving, and you don't have to reckon with how empty the ground feels under you. The mule's name was Gert. I named her that because she reminded me of a woman from Laramie who had the same expression of profound disappointment in everything around her. Gert the mule made it 4 days before she sat down in a creek bed about 20 miles north of Fort Robinson and refused to stand up again. I sat with her for a while. The creek was running cold and clear over flat limestone, and there were cottonwoods along the bank, their leaves gone yellow, and the light coming through them was the color of old lamp oil. Gert looked at me once more with that disappointment, and then she died, and I sat there for another hour before I got up. I cached what I couldn't carry, marked the spot, and walked north. It was the second day of walking that I came up over a rise and saw the camp. It was Lakota. I knew that from the lodge design and the way the horses were picketed 2 lines, east-facing, which was different from how Cheyenne men set their horses in my experience. There were maybe 15 lodges, smoke coming off 3 of them. A large fire in the center of the camp with people moving around it, and even from the ridge I could see that something was wrong with the movement. Too tense, too contained, people standing in clusters, not talking the way people talk when they're at ease. I almost turned around. I want to be honest about that. I was 43 years old and I was on foot with no horse and no particular value to offer, and whatever was happening in that camp below was none of my business. I had enough experience with the plains to know that a lone white man walking into a Lakota camp in the fall of 1876, the year after the greasy grass, the year the army was still pushing hard in all directions, was not making a smart choice. I knew that. I also knew that the woman on her knees in the center of that camp, with 3 men standing around her in a way that isn't hard to interpret in any language, needed somebody to do something. I went down. I didn't run. Running would have been wrong. I walked at a measured pace down the slope, keeping my hands visible, my rifle slung muzzle down in a way that was meant to read as non-threatening, and did mostly, because by the time I was 60 yards from the camp, edge 2 men had come out to meet me, and neither of them had a weapon in hand. They were watching me the way you watch something you're not sure about yet. I stopped, put my hands up, then brought them down slowly, then pointed to myself and said my name. Elias Cutter. Then I pointed at the men nearest the woman and said the only Lakota word I knew well, which was a word that meant wrong or not right. I'd learned it years before on the survey from a man named Joseph 2 Clouds who'd worked with our crew one season as a guide. It was a word I'd heard him use when the crew foreman had been rough with one of the laborers. He'd said it quietly, just the one word, and the foreman had stopped. I didn't understand why it worked then. I understand it now. Some words don't need translation. The 2 men who'd come out to meet me looked at each other. One of them was older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and a red trade blanket around his shoulders. He looked at the situation by the fire, and then he looked at me, and there was something in his face I couldn't name then but can name now. It was the look of a man who is tired of a problem and has just been handed a possible way out of it that doesn't cost him anything. He said something to the other man. The other man went back toward the fire. The older man looked at me and touched his chest. "Mato Sapa," he said, "Black Bear, that was how I met the chief." What I learned over the next hour, through a combination of his limited English and my even more limited Lakota, and a considerable amount of pointing and drawing in the dirt, was this: the 3 men by the fire were not Lakota. They were a mix, 1 white, 2 mixed blood, and they'd come into the camp 2 days before with trade goods, and had gotten the chief's permission to camp on the edge of the group's territory for 1 night. But they'd stayed, and in staying they'd gotten drunk on whiskey they'd been carrying, and in getting drunk they decided that the woman, whose name I didn't learn until much later, and I'll get to that, was available to them in a way she was not. She was Lakota, a widow. Her husband had died the previous winter, and by some technicality of custom that I didn't fully understand, her status was unsettled, not claimed. The chief was her husband's uncle's friend, not a blood relation, and his authority over her situation was indirect, and the 3 men had found that indirect authority and pushed on it. And the camp had been tense for 2 days because Mato Sapa didn't want open conflict with armed white men, but also didn't want what was happening to continue. He told me all this, and then he looked at me and waited. I knew what he was waiting for. It wasn't asking. It was more like an offering, a door he was holding open, and it was up to me whether I walked through it. I looked at the woman for the first time clearly. She was kneeling, but she wasn't broken. That was the thing I noticed. Her back was straight. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the fire and not at the men around her. And there was something in that not looking that was deliberate. She had removed herself, in whatever way a person can do that. She was there and not there simultaneously, and the men around her hadn't noticed because they were drunk and loud and busy with the story they were telling themselves about what they were going to do. I was 50 feet away, and I had a rifle and a name and nothing else. I thought about Gert the mule sitting down in the creek. I thought about the empty space under me where a purpose should have been. I said to the chief, "What would it take?" He understood me. He'd been waiting for me to understand him. He said a number. It was in Lakota, but the number system had enough overlap that I got it. 7. Then he mimed something, the motion of one thing standing in for another. I understood he was talking about an exchange. He was telling me what it would cost me to walk into that camp and take a role that gave me the authority to end this. Not by the woman, by the standing. By the position that allowed me to say, "She goes with me," and have it mean something that those 3 men couldn't argue with, because an arrangement between 2 men, even a white man and a Lakota chief, outranked what they thought they'd been promised. I had $3 silver. He'd said 7. I showed him the 3 and a folding knife and a quarter-pound of salt in a twist of cloth. He looked at those things for a long time. Then he looked at me with that tired problem-solved face, and he held out his hand. I put the $3 and the knife and the salt in it. He closed his fingers. He nodded once. He said something in Lakota, and I heard my name in it, Cutter, used as a kind of designation, and I understood that whatever he'd said had just changed my standing in this camp. He walked me to the fire. I'll tell you what I said to those 3 men, and I'll tell you it was not heroic, and it was not eloquent. It was plain and cold and very certain. I told them that the woman was going with me, that the chief had arranged it, and that anyone who had a problem with that arrangement was welcome to take it up with me. I said that last part looking at the tallest one, the white man, who was the one carrying himself like he was the decision-maker in the group, and I held his eyes until he looked away. He looked away. The drunk ones always do, eventually. They have no real bottom to them. The bluster is the whole structure, and once you don't flinch at the bluster, there's nothing left. They packed up that evening and left the camp going south. Mato Sapa walked me to where the woman was sitting. He spoke to her, and she looked up at me for the first time. She had dark eyes and a cut above her right eyebrow that was maybe a day old and healing. She looked at me the way I imagine I looked at things I wasn't sure about, careful, measuring. Mato Sapa said her name. Which hyena? I didn't know then what it meant. I found out later in her language it was something close to a woman who endures. That wasn't a name given at birth. That was a name she'd been given after her husband died by the women of the camp, and in their tradition names could change to mark what a person had become. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I still do. She looked at me, and then she looked at the direction the 3 men had gone, and then she looked at Mato Sapa and she said something in Lakota. He answered. She looked at me again. She said in English that surprised me completely, "You paid for Mule price." I looked at Mato Sapa. He had the flat expression of a man who has been keeping a small secret. I said, "You speak English?" She said, "Some." I said, "How much is a mule?" She said, "Not much." We looked at each other, and there it was, the first thing I ever understood about witch hyena. She had a sense of the absurd that was entirely her own. She'd just been through 2 days of something that would have broken a lot of people, and she was standing in the cold making a joke about the price I'd paid for the right to help her, not to diminish what had happened, to refuse to let it be the only thing. I liked her immediately. That scared me. I won't tell the next weeks quickly, because they don't deserve to be told quickly. Mato Sapa's camp was moving south and east for winter, toward better shelter ground along a tributary of the Niobrara. He gave me permission to travel with the group for that distance, not charity, I think, but assessment. He was watching me, watching how I handled the horses I didn't have, how I walked beside people I didn't know, how I carried myself in a situation where I had no status and no assets, except that I'd bought a position once and was trying to live up to it. Witch Hyena walked with the women and I walked on the edge of the group, and we didn't talk much for the first 4 days. When we made camp, I helped with what I could, gathering wood, which anyone can do, and working on a pack frame that had cracked and needed splicing, which I did with a technique I'd learned on the survey using green rawhide that shrinks tight when it dries. The man whose frame it was, a quiet man called High Elk, watched me do it and didn't say anything, but the next morning the frame was holding and he looked at it and then at me and nodded once. That was enough. On the 5th day, Witch Hyena walked near me for a while, not with me exactly, near me. She said, "You are surveyor." I said, "Was." She said, "What are you now?" That was the question, wasn't it? I told her I didn't know yet. She looked at the ground we were walking on, flat grass, dry, the kind of ground I'd have been calculating slope angles on a few years back, and she said that the ground usually tells a person what they're supposed to be doing on it if they stop long enough to ask. I'd never heard it put that way. I'd spent 10 years reading the ground for other men's railroads, and I'd never once thought to ask it anything. We walked another 1/4 mile without talking. Then she said, "Your mule, she died." I said yes. She said, "Where?" I told her. The creek bed, the cottonwoods, the limestone flat. She knew the place immediately, knew it the way people who have moved across land their whole lives know it, not by a name on a map but by the sound and smell and feel of it. She told me a name for that place in Lakota, a long word, and when I asked what it meant she said it was something about water that stops to rest. I thought about Gert. That seemed right. I got my survey kit out of cache on the 8th day of the journey. Witch Hyena came with me to the spot where I'd marked it, which surprised me, and she watched me unpack the transit level and the rod and the notebooks with their 10 years of elevation data. She turned the notebook pages carefully, not reading them, but looking at the numbers and diagrams the way you might look at a language you've heard spoken, but never seen written. She said something I didn't understand and then said it again in English. She said, "You measured all this." I said, 600 miles, more or less. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did they say thank you?" I thought about the handshake, $47 and a handshake. I said, "Not really." She put the notebook down carefully on the pack, and she didn't say anything else about it. But she was angry on my behalf. I could see it in the set of her jaw and the way she breathed out through her nose. It wasn't a dramatic anger. It was the quiet fury of someone who has seen a particular kind of wrong before and recognizes it on sight. That was the second thing I understood about her. She kept accounts. She knew what things were worth and she noticed when the accounting was crooked. I didn't know what to do with that. A woman being angry on my behalf was not something I had experience with. We reached the winter camp on the 12th day. A sheltered bend in the tributary, cottonwood and box elder for windbreak, south-facing slope that would hold some warmth in January. A good piece of ground. I could see immediately why Mato Sapa had chosen it. The slope of the terrain would drain cold air down and away from the camp on clear nights, which was the difference between -10 and -20 in a bad January. And on the plains that kind of difference was the difference between endurable and not. I said this to Mato Sapa, explaining the drainage logic. He listened with the patient attention of a man who already knows something and is listening to you figure out that he knows it. When I finished, he said something in which Hyena translated. He says his grandfather's grandfather chose this bend. It has always been a good camp. I said he was right. Mato Sapa said something else. Witch Hyena, hesitated before translating. Then he says the ground told his grandfather's grandfather, same as it told you. I looked at witch hyena. She looked back at me with those careful, measuring eyes and a trace of something that wasn't quite a smile. I stayed. I want to be clear about what that decision looked like from the outside, because I know how it sounds and I know what most men my age, in that situation, would have said about it. A 43-year-old white man settling in at the edge of a Lakota winter camp with no particular plan. People at Fort Robinson, when I went in for supplies in November, looked at me a certain way. I didn't much care. I'd spent enough of my life being useful and invisible that invisibility held no threat for me anymore. And being looked at sideways by men who'd never walked 600 miles of high plains was not something that kept me up at night. What kept me up at night was the work. I started out doing what I could. Firewood was the obvious thing I could cut and haul, and the bad knee didn't prevent that. The camp had a need for a specific kind of lodge pole that had to come from a stand of lodgepole pine about 4 miles north, and getting them back to camp was a half-day job that I could do with the rope and the travois frame I'd improvised from deadfall. I did that twice a week. High Elk helped me on the second trip, without being asked, and after that a younger man named Runs Far came along too, and then it became a thing that 3 of us did, and something shifted in how I was seen in the camp. It's a strange thing to describe. It wasn't a moment. It was an accumulation. A man who comes every day and does the work without complaining and doesn't make himself the center of anything, that man, over time, stops being an outsider. He becomes a piece of the structure, part of the thing that holds. By December, I was doing more. I had my transit level, and I started making detailed maps of the surrounding terrain, partly because it was the thing I knew how to do, and partly because Mato Sapa had a practical problem I thought I could help with. The army was moving through the region in irregular patterns, and the chief needed to know the high ground, the approach lines, the places where a large force could be seen from 2 miles, and a small group could move without being seen at all. I didn't ask why he needed this. I just made the maps, accurate to within a few yards, with the elevation lines I could calculate in my sleep. He looked at those maps for a long time the first time I showed them to him. He pointed to 2 places, a ridgeline east of camp and a draw to the southwest, and spoke in Lakota. Witch hyena translated. He says these 2 places. He didn't know about the draw. I said, it runs about 30 feet below the surrounding grade, hard to see from outside. He said something else. She said, he says you see the ground the way a Lakota man sees it. I said that was the best thing anyone had told me in years, and I meant it. He studied the maps further, tracing the elevation lines with one finger, and I watched him read them, not as a man learning a new system, but as a man confirming something he already knew through a different language. He knew the draw. He knew the ridgeline. He was reading my numbers as a check against his own knowledge, and where they matched he nodded slightly, and where they didn't he said something to witch hyena that she translated as, he thinks the north side of the ridge is steeper than you drew. I went back out the next day and checked. He was right. The north face dropped at roughly 40 degrees, steeper than I'd estimated from below. I corrected the map and brought it back, and he looked at the correction and said one word in Lakota that witch hyena said meant something like, good, or right, something like both. She translated that, and Mato Sapa looked at me with that tired problem face, but this time there was something else in it. Respect is too large a word for what it was. It was more like acknowledgement. You are what I thought you were when I let you walk into my camp. That's what the look said. The mapping work pulled me further into the rhythms of the camp. I was out most mornings before the light was full, setting up the instrument on whatever high point I was working from that day, and after a while the camp became accustomed to seeing me head out at first light with the transit case on my shoulder. Some of the younger men started asking about the instrument, not through witch hyena, just through pointing and a kind of interested silence that means the same thing in any language. I showed them how the scope worked, how the bubble level told you when the instrument was plumb, how you read the rod and what the number meant. One young man named Crow Feather took to it right away. He had the patience and the precision the work requires, and within a week he was reading the rod for me from 200 yards while I stayed at the instrument, which was far more efficient than doing it alone. We made a good team. We never said much. I didn't have enough Lakota and he had no English, but the work made its own language between us and that was sufficient. Witch Hyena saw us working together one afternoon and said something I had to ask her to repeat. She said, "He looks like you." I looked at Crow Feather, who was 18 years old and as Lakota as the ridge he was standing on. I said, "How?" She said, "The way he looks at the ground, like he is asking it something." I stored that away. There was a problem in the camp that December that had nothing to do with the army or the winter. I'll tell it plainly because it belongs in this story, and leaving it out would be dishonest. There was a man in the camp I'll call Broken Bow. That wasn't his full name or his family name, just the name I knew him by in my own head. He was a widower, maybe 35, and he had been making his interest in Witch Hyena Plain before I arrived. Not formally, not through any arrangement. The customs around widows and remarriage involved agreements I never fully understood, layers of family connection and tribal standing, but informally, in the way men everywhere make their interest plain. He didn't like me. I understood his position. I was an outsider who had arrived with nothing and been given a place that in his thinking should have been his. Maybe that was fair. I had no claim here. I wasn't from this land or these people. In his position I might have felt the same. He made himself a small, persistent problem. He moved one of my equipment stakes twice, which set my survey work back a morning each time. He said something to Crow Feather that made the young man avoid me for 3 days, until whatever it was wore off. He spoke to 2 of the older men in camp. I didn't know what he said, but I noticed afterward that those men were more formal with me, less easy. I said nothing about any of this. I just kept working. The thing that finally made it direct was smaller than you'd expect. It was a set of snowshoes. I'd been having trouble moving across the crusted snow to my survey points because the crust was too thin to hold my weight but thick enough to cut into my legs if I broke through. I needed snowshoes. I didn't know how to make them properly, not the Lakota design that worked best in the snow. I asked Witch Hyena if she could show me the technique. She said she would, and she started working on a pair. She had the bent wood and the hide strips and the skill. Broken Bow saw her doing this and said something to her in Lakota, sharp, which she didn't answer. He said it again. She didn't look up from her work. He said a third thing, and she put the frame down in the snow and looked at him with an expression I wouldn't have wanted aimed at me. Then he said something to me directly, in English he'd apparently been keeping to himself. "She is not your woman." I said, "No, she isn't anyone's, that's the whole point." He stared at me. I think he'd expected anger or defensiveness. What I'd said was neither. It was just true, and being true it didn't give him anything to push against. He said, "You have nothing here. No horses, no family." I said, "That's right." He stopped. I said, "I have no claim on her. She does what she wants. That includes making snowshoes for whoever she chooses. If she decides to make yours instead, I'll walk in the snow." He looked at Witch Hyena. She had picked up the snowshoe frame again and was back to work on it, not looking at either of us. Her jaw was set in the way I'd already learned meant a decision had been made and the subject was closed. Broken Bow stood there another moment, then he walked away. Witch Hyena worked on the snowshoe for another few minutes in silence. Then, without looking up, she said, "You did not argue your position." I said, "It wasn't mine to argue." She said, "No, it was mine." I said, "Right." She said, "He knows that now." There was a pause. Then she said, still not looking up, I measured your foot size when you were not watching. To get the right frame. I looked at the frame. It was the right size. I said, when did you do that? She said, November. I thought about November. I'd been in camp barely a month. She'd been watching and measuring in November. I said, you planned these from November. She kept her eyes on the frame. I planned things carefully. I let that sit. It sat well. Broken Bow left the camp in January, family reasons to the south. I understood later. I don't know what became of him. He was a man who wanted something that chose not to be his, and he went somewhere else. That's the whole story of him, and I wish him no harm in it. Witch Hyena and I were not anything, not for a long time. I want to be precise about this because it's the part that people get wrong when they hear the story. They want it to have been immediate or romantic in the way stories are supposed to be romantic. It wasn't. It was slow and careful and practical, and mostly it was built out of work. She had her own work. She was skilled with horses in a way that I wasn't, and she spent her mornings working with a mare that had gone difficult after a stumble, using a patience and a technique that I watched sometimes when I thought she wasn't watching me watch her. She was skilled with her hands in the way that women who have kept families alive through hard winters are skilled with their hands, not delicately, but precisely. She could sew a break in a saddle girth in the dark by touch. She could read the signs of a coming storm off the way horses held their heads before I could smell anything changing in the air. She was also, and this is the part I didn't know how to carry, lonely. Not lonely in a dramatic way. In the quiet way of a person who has lost the person they told things to and has not yet found another one. I recognized it because I was the same way. A person can be in a camp full of other people and be entirely alone, and Witch Hyena and I were both that way, and we both recognized it in each other without saying so for a long time. The first real conversation we had happened in late November. I was sitting outside the small lodge Mato Sapa had allowed me at the edge of camp, going through my notebooks by lamplight, and she came and sat near me with no particular explanation. I didn't ask for one. We sat for a while in the cold, and I showed her what the survey numbers meant, how the elevation lines read, how you could look at a column of figures and see a mountain in it, if you knew how. She followed the explanation the way a smart person follows something new, leaning in slightly, asking one precise question at the exact right moment. She asked, the railroad you measured, it went through here. I said, not through here, west of here, 40 miles, maybe 50. She said, I saw it. The iron horse. I had heard that phrase, iron horse, used before, but hearing it from her was different. She wasn't using it as a metaphor. She was using it as a description, something she had actually seen and was naming with the most accurate name she could find. I asked what she'd thought of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I thought someone measured all of this. She gestured at the dark plain around us. Someone walked here and put numbers on it, and then the iron horse came. The numbers called the horse. I had never thought about my work that way. 10 years of grade calculations and elevation surveys, and I had never once thought that I was doing a kind of calling. That the numbers I put in notebooks were a kind of language that brought large metal things across the continent. I said, I suppose that's right. She said, does that feel good, to have called something? I thought about it honestly. I said, it would have if I'd known what I was calling. She looked at the lamplight on the page of the notebook. She said, now you know. I didn't know what she meant exactly, and I didn't ask, but I thought about it for a long time afterward. Weeks, honestly. Lying in the cold in the small lodge at night, listening to the wind off the plain, thinking about what she'd said and what it might mean. By January, I understood what she meant. The iron horse had taken the country and given it to men who owned things and didn't know the names of the places they'd taken. I'd measured every inch of the route, and I'd never learned a single name for any of it, not in any language. 600 miles of ground, and I couldn't tell you the name of a single draw or bend or high place in any language except the numbers in my notebooks. Witch Hyena knew hundreds of names. She knew the name of the creek where Gert had died. She knew the name of the place where the prairie dogs made their colony, and the name of the high wind that came from the northwest in January, and the name of the stars in the winter sky. All of them. Not the names I'd learned in school, but different names. Older ones that described what the stars did and how they related to each other. I started asking her to teach me. That's when things changed between us. Not romantically, or not only romantically, not yet. It was more fundamental. I was a man who had spent his whole life measuring and naming the land for other men's purposes, and I had never known the land's own names for itself. The names Witch Hyena knew were the names the land had given itself, through the people who'd lived on it long enough to listen. Learning them felt like being handed something I hadn't known was missing. Like finding the word for a thing you'd felt but never been able to say. She was a patient teacher. She didn't explain things the way a schoolteacher explains things. She would say a word once and point at the thing it named and then leave me with it. The word would sit in me for a few days, turning over, and usually by the time I'd seen the thing again in different light or different weather, I understood the word better than I would have if she'd explained it. It was a teaching style built for the outdoors, for moving through the world, not for sitting still with a book. It suited me better than anything I'd learned in formal schooling. In return, I showed her more of the survey work. How the instruments operated, how you could calculate the height of a distant ridge without leaving the valley, how the numbers in the notebooks translated to the shapes of the land. She was genuinely interested, not politely interested, but the real kind, where she would push on a thing she didn't understand and not let go of it until it made sense. She had a mind that grabbed on to logical systems and didn't release them. She'd been using Lakota navigation methods her whole life, which were sophisticated in their own way, and she could see immediately where the survey instruments extended those methods and where they had gaps. She pointed out one of those gaps to me in February, on a cold, clear afternoon when I'd brought the transit level out to work on a new section of the terrain map. She watched me set it up and she said, "You can measure how high. Can you measure how the ground thinks?" I said, "How it thinks." She said, "Where it wants to go, where the water goes when it melts, where the horses want to walk." I said those things weren't in the instrument. She said, "No, they are in the person." That was true. That was a true thing. The survey instruments could tell you elevation and grade and distance, but they couldn't tell you what the land was doing, where it was pulling toward, what it was becoming over time. That lived in the person who'd been on it long enough to watch it change. Witch Hyena had been moving across this country since she was born. She knew things about it that would have taken me 20 years to learn, and I might still have gotten them wrong. I told her that. I told her what she knew was worth more than what was in my notebooks. She looked at me in that measuring way she had. She said, "Both are worth something." Then she said, "Together they are worth more." I didn't say anything. The wind was coming off the ridge and it was cold enough that my eyes were watering, which I was going to blame on the wind if she said anything about it, but she didn't. She just picked up one end of the transit level case and started carrying it back toward camp, which meant I had to pick up the other end, and we walked back together like that, carrying the thing between us, and that was as close to a declaration as either of us made for another 2 months. There's a particular quality to late winter on the northern plains that I can't adequately describe except to say it's its own thing. Not the same cold as December, which has a clean bite. Late February cold is older, meaner, like something that's been waiting a long time and is tired of waiting. The sky does things, long flat gray with a yellow edge on the western horizon, or a white so bright that everything under it looks like it might be the inside of a lamp. The animals are thin. The people are thin. Everything is conserved, held close, burning slow to last until the ground thaws. I got sick in late February. Not dangerously sick, but the bad knee had an old companion, something in my chest that would go wrong in cold winters, a tightness that I'd had since a bad pneumonia in the winter of '71. It came back. For about 10 days I spent most of my time in the lodge, which I was not grateful for. I'm not a man who does well with stillness. I get into my own head too far. Witch Hyena brought me a tea made from something she collected from the cottonwood bark. A preparation I didn't know, bitter and hot, that did something useful because by the 4th day the tightness was loosening. She came morning and evening with the tea, and she would stay for a while, and we talked more during those 10 days than we had in any equivalent period before. The sickness and the close quarters loosened something. You can't be as careful when you're cold and coughing. Things come out that you've been holding back. I told her about the survey. Not the pride version, not the version where it was 10 years of useful work. The real version, how I'd been good at it, and it had taken everything I had, and in the end it had left me with nothing, and I wasn't sure what that said about me, except that I'd been a fool for a long time and maybe was still being one. She listened to all of this without offering comfort, which was exactly right. She just listened, and when I was done she said, "A man who builds a road, he is not less than the man who walks it." I said, "He gets paid less." She said, "Yes, that is a different problem." I said, "What problem?" She said, "The problem of men who take more than they built." I laughed. It hurt my chest and I stopped, but the laugh was real. She looked at me with those serious, careful eyes, and then something in them shifted and she laughed too, briefly, and I thought, there it is. That's the thing. That's the thing I've been walking toward for 2 years without knowing it. She came back that evening with more tea, and she stayed past dark, and we sat close in the small lodge with the lamp between us, talking in the mix of English and Lakota that we developed between us. A language that didn't belong to either of our languages but was entirely ours. She told me about her husband. His name was Spotted Eagle, and he'd been a good man, she said, which she said simply, the way you state a fact. He died of a fever that took 3 people in the camp over one winter, and there was nothing that could have been done, and she knew that, and she had made her peace with it mostly. But peace is not the same thing as not missing someone, and she still missed him. I told her about a woman I'd been close to in Cheyenne, before the railroad let me go. A widow named Catharine who ran a boarding house and was funny and direct, and had looked at me one evening over the supper table and said, "Elias, you're a good man, but you're not here yet. Come back when you've figured out where you're going." She'd meant it kindly, and I'd been hurt by it, and I'd left, and I'd never seen her again, and she'd been right, and sometimes I thought about that. Witch Hyena listened to this. Then she said, "You are here now." I said, "I'm in a Lakota winter camp on the Niobrara with a bad chest and $3 worth of standing to my name." She said, "Yes." I understood what she meant. I was here, not passing through, not measuring someone else's ground. Here, in this particular bend of this particular tributary, with these people and this cold and this woman. And for the first time in years, the ground under me felt solid. I don't know exactly when I understood that what I felt for her was what it was. It didn't announce itself. It accumulated, the way most real things accumulate. I know that by the 6th day of the sickness, when she came with the morning tea and sat across the lamp from me, and I watched the light on her face and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time and maybe had never felt quite that way, I knew. I didn't say anything about it. I was sick and she was taking care of me, and it would have been a wrong moment, but I knew. What I also knew was that she was deciding something about me during those 10 days. I could feel it the way you feel a current in a river even when the surface looks still. She was watching how I held myself when I was down. Not down the way I'd been down at the camp in September, empty down, drifting down. Down with the chest sickness, but still asking questions, still interested in the maps on the day she came, and I had them spread out on the floor of the lodge, and was working through the elevation profiles even with my chest tight. She watched me do that, and she said something to herself in Lakota, not to me, And when I asked what she'd said, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "I said, he does not stop." I said, "Stop what?" She said, "Caring about the ground." I thought about that for the remaining 4 days of the sickness. A man who doesn't stop caring about the ground. That was one way to say it. Another way was, a man who hadn't given up. I'd been drifting for 2 years, and in those 2 years I'd done 100 jobs without caring about a single one of them, but even the drifting had been purposeful in its way. I was always measuring, always noting elevations in the back of my mind, always watching how the water moved and where the soil changed. The survey habit had gone too deep to be let go. And maybe that was what she saw, not the accomplishment, not the history of being used and discarded. The habit that remained when everything else had been stripped away, the thing that was still him when nothing else was. I'd never had a woman see me that specifically before. The specificity of it was what I didn't know how to carry. On the 10th day the tightness was gone, and I ate a full meal and went outside and stood in the February air, which was mean and yellow-white, and breathed it in without it hurting. I stayed out there a long time. The camp was going about its morning, and the horses were visible against the snow at the picket line, and the smoke from the fires was going straight up in the still cold. I could see the ridgeline to the east that I'd mapped, with its corrected north face, and I thought about everything that had ended up here. The mule, the drifting, the $8, the $3 silver, and a knife and a pinch of salt, the 12 days walking to this bend. The 10 years before that, the whole crooked road. Witch Hyena came outside with a blanket and put it around my shoulders from behind. She didn't say anything. She stood there for a moment with her hands on the blanket at my shoulders, and then she moved to stand beside me, and we looked at the ridgeline together. After a while she said, "You should eat something warm again before you work." I said, "I know." She said, "You are going to go work anyway." I said, "Probably." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, something in between, something entirely hers. She went back inside, and I stayed out there a little longer looking at the ridge, and then I went in and ate something warm. And then I went to work. That was how we were. That was the shape of it through the rest of the winter, not declared, not formal, but a fact we were both living with, and neither of us was in a hurry to name. There was something right about that. Some things you name too soon and you damage them. We were both people who'd been hurt by moving too fast toward things that felt good, and we were both people who'd learned to let things settle before committing their whole weight to them. So we let it settle. The spring was still a month away when something happened that I need to tell about, because it's where the protector part of this story earned itself a second time. There were 2 men who came into the camp from the east in mid-March, just as the worst of the cold was breaking. Not soldiers, private men, landmen, the kind that worked for the ranching interests that were pressing into the territory from the south. I'd seen their type before, well-dressed for the plains, which meant they weren't from the plains. Clean boots. One of them had a surveyor's mark on his coat, a small badge from a commercial firm out of Omaha that I'd heard of but never worked for. They wanted to talk to Mato Sapa about the land. I'm going to tell what happened at that meeting plainly. Mato Sapa was a man of great dignity and considerable intelligence, and he had been dealing with land negotiations for decades, and he knew what was happening and what was likely to happen, and he had made his calculations. He didn't need me. But the Omaha surveyor, the one with the badge, had brought a set of survey maps that were, I could see from 10 feet away, badly wrong. The elevation profiles for the tributary valley were calculated off an old base datum that put the flood line of the Niobrara about 12 feet lower than it actually ran in wet years, which meant the usable rangeland they were describing to the chief, and the acreage they were basing their numbers on, was significantly overstated. Understating the flood reach of a river by 12 feet on flat country changes your usable acreage calculation by a lot. I said nothing at first. It wasn't my meeting and it wasn't my land. But Mato Sapa looked at me at a certain point, looked at me directly, in a way that meant something, and I understood he was giving me an opening. I stepped forward. I identified myself to the Omaha man as a surveyor, 10 years with Hargrove Pell's crew, government-contracted route surveys for the transcontinental spur. Then I asked him politely what datum he'd used for his flood line calculations. He told me. I told him his flood line was wrong by 12 feet. I had the maps. I showed him. The tributary valley's high water mark from the spring runoff of 1874, a year I'd been in the country and had recorded, was visible in my notes as a specific elevation, and his base datum didn't match that elevation. His usable acreage was off by somewhere between 15 and 20%, depending on which sections you were talking about. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it didn't matter for the purposes of the negotiation. I said, it matters for the purposes of the truth. The other man, the one who wasn't the surveyor, looked at me with the expression of a man who has been in negotiations that went wrong before, and is watching this one going the same direction. The Omaha man said the survey discrepancy could be reconciled later. I said, it could, or it could be reconciled now, in which case the chief knows what he's agreeing to before he agrees to it. There was a long quiet. Mato Sapa said something to which Hyena low, and she translated it to me in a murmur. He says, let him speak. The meeting went on for another 2 hours. The Omaha men revised their maps twice, with my corrections, which they did with the rigid politeness of men who are not happy but have no technical ground to stand on. When it was finished, the numbers were still not good for Mato Sapa. The land pressure was real, and the power behind it was real, and maps couldn't fix that, but they were honest numbers. He knew what he was looking at. He knew because I had made sure he knew. That was all I could do. When the men from Omaha had left the camp, Mato Sapa sat with me again, outside in the thin afternoon sun. He didn't say anything for a while. The pipe again. The patient silence. Then he said, which Hyena translating, that a man who uses his skill for the people he is with, and not only for himself, is a man worth the ground he stands on. I said I just told the truth. He said yes, that was what he meant. That evening which Hyena found me at my lodge. She sat down beside me with no ceremony, closer than she usually sat. She said, the Omaha man, he did not like you. I said no. She said good. I looked at her. She was looking at the last light on the eastern ridge, the corrected ridge 12 feet taller in the flood calculation than it had been that morning. There was something in her face that I hadn't quite seen before, or hadn't let myself see. Not gratitude. Something past gratitude. The look of a woman who has been watching a man carefully for months, and has just seen the last thing she needed to see. She said quietly, you used your skill for us. I said it seemed right. She said it was right. Then she said, you are a good man, Elias Cutter. She said it the same way she'd said her husband had been a good man. Simply, as a statement of fact, the way you'd say the ridge is to the east or the river runs north. Not a compliment offered to please. A conclusion reached after careful consideration and now stated plainly. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my voice entirely right then. We sat together in the last of the light, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her beside me in the cold, and neither of us moved until the evening fire was lit across the camp, and the smell of the cook's smoke reached us, and there was a reason to get up. The spring came the way springs come on the plains, not gently, but all at once, like the land has been holding its breath for 5 months and finally lets it go. The snow went in 3 days in mid-March, and then the temperature dropped again, and the mud froze and cracked, and then there was a week of rain, and then one morning I walked out of the lodge and the air smelled like the earth waking up, and that was that. Spring. Mato Sapa came to me in the first week of April. He sat with me outside the lodge in the new morning sun, which was warm enough to feel but not warm enough to fully trust, and he smoked his pipe and didn't say anything for a while. I'd learned by then to wait with him. He had his own timing. He said, through his English and the bits of Lakota I now had, that he had been watching me. He said that a man who had come with nothing and had made himself useful without making himself the center of anything was a particular kind of man. He said that kind of man was not common. I didn't say anything. He said that witch hyena had not looked like herself since her husband died. He said she had come back to herself this winter. I said I was glad to hear that. He looked at me in that way he had, that tired problem face that I'd come to understand was not tiredness at all but a very patient intelligence. He said, "She chose you. I did not choose for her." I said, "I know." He said, "You know this is what makes it right." I said I did. He smoked for a while. Then he reached into his blanket and he brought out a small pouch and he put it in my hand. It was the 3 silver dollars I'd given him in the fall, plus 4 more that I hadn't given him. I looked at it. He said, "Now it is 7. I said, "What does 7 mean?" He said something in Lakota that witch hyena translated later when I told her about the conversation. What he'd said was something like, 7 is what a good horse costs, or a good man. Either way, more than a broken mule. I held those 7 silver dollars in my hand for a long time that morning, sitting in the spring sun with the camp waking up around me, and the smell of the new mud and the horses and the cottonwood pollen on the air, and I thought about all the things those 7 coins were. They were what I was worth, in the accounting of a man who kept real accounts. They were the difference between mule price and horse price. They were the first time anyone had ever paid me what I was worth, and done it voluntarily, and done it because they thought I'd earned it. I was 43 years old. I was sitting in the spring mud. I had a survey kit and 7 silver dollars and the Lakota words for 100 things I'd been standing next to my whole life without knowing their names. And in a minute, I was going to go find witch hyena because she'd seen me coming from the horse line, and she was walking toward me with that straight-backed walk she had, and a look on her face that I will carry to my grave. She came and she sat next to me in the mud, which she did without ceremony, which was entirely her. She looked at the coins in my hand. She said he gave them back. I said +4. She looked at me, not with wonder, with something quieter and more particular than wonder, the look of a person who has made a careful decision and knows it was right. She put her hand over my hand, both hands actually folding over mine with the coins in them. Her hands were rough from the winter's work and warm from having just been near the morning fire. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I closed my fingers around the coins in her hands, and I just held on. We stayed like that for a while, in the April sun, with the camp moving around us and the horses at the picket line tossing their heads at the new smells coming off the thawing ground. I had measured 600 miles of this country for other men's purposes. I had put my back and my bad knee and my 10 best years into work that had made other men rich and left my name in the records nobody reads. I had been let go with a handshake, and I had drifted for 2 years in the empty space where a purpose should have been. And then a mule died in a creek bed with a name that meant water that stops to rest, and I walked north, and a chief who was tired of a problem opened a door and I walked through it. And on the other side of that door was a woman who counted real costs and kept real accounts and knew the names of things and had looked at me with those careful eyes and decided, not quickly, not easily, but finally and fully, that I was worth the 7. I didn't go back to the railroad. I stayed in that country. I made maps for the next 30 years, not for railroad companies, for anyone who needed accurate terrain surveys, the army sometimes, the territorial government sometimes, ranchers who needed to know where their water came from and where it was going. Good work. Work that had my name on it. Witch hyena named it. Not the work exactly, but the way I did it. She said one evening, years later, watching me work the transit level on a hillside above our place, We had a place by then, a ranch on the Niobrara Bend, proper ground. She watched me work and she said, "You ask the ground now." I put the instrument down and I looked at her. She was standing in the late afternoon light with her arms crossed and her hair loose in the wind and the same straight-back stillness she'd had on her knees that first day, but different now, comfortable in it, at home in her own bones. I said, "I learned that from someone." She said, "The ground taught you. I just told you it was talking." That was Witch Hyena. That was exactly her, taking no credit for the things she'd given me. I picked up the instrument. She walked up the hill and stood beside me and looked out at the valley below, the ranch, the Niobrara Bend, the cottonwoods that were going gold in the fall light. She put her hand on my arm, not to hold me up, not because she needed anything, just the gesture of a woman standing next to the man she'd chosen, in the country they both knew the names of, in the evening of a long good day. "The 7 silver dollars are on a shelf in our house. I haven't spent them. I won't. Some things you don't spend. Some things you keep because they're the only record that tells the true story of what you were worth, not what the railroad thought, not what the handshake said." What a tired chief decided on a fall morning, when he looked at everything I had, and decided it was enough. It was enough.